influenced what you're about to hear. And so I'm currently the ethics representative on the Oversight Committee for Personalized Experimental Therapeutics. As we'll be talking about over the course of our time together today, personalized experimental therapeutics, N of 1 trials, what was sometimes referred to as bespoke medicine, creates certain kinds of challenges from an ethical regulatory standpoint that have made traditional structures, such as institutional review boards, difficult to use in that context. And so at Boston Children's Hospital, we've constructed a separate entity, so-called OCPET, this committee that I just referred to, that has oversight of all of the proposed N of 1 and other and N of few experimental trials. And as we'll talk about in a second, we'll see why perhaps traditional IRB structures aren't necessarily constructed to be able to provide full oversight in those settings. I was one of the dozen implicated co-conspirators in a talk, or in a paper rather, that came out in 2017, The Ethical Challenges Confronted when Providing Nusinersen Treatment for Spinal Muscular Atrophy, when the first of the truly successful widespread oligonucleotides, antisense oligonucleotides, became available for the treatment of what over the entirety of my career had been one of the scourges of pediatric neurology, spinal muscular atrophy. A group of us felt that there were some particular challenges that arose and wanted to outline those and create a framework. As you'll see over the course of our time together, and any other time you've encountered ethicists, we love having frameworks as ways of thinking about problems, and we become especially devoted to them if we're trying to deal with something that's somewhat novel in everyone's experience. And then finally, I was the member of a group that is now gone into suspended animation, Bioethics of Individualized Therapeutics Working Group, which was sponsored by NYU Langone Health, not very far from where you all are sitting. So I'm hoping after we spend our time together today that you'll be able to identify how the ethics of a risk-benefit or burden-benefit calculation and informed consent differ significantly in N of 1 experimental therapeutics versus randomized controlled trials, that you'll be able to identify some of the ethical challenges which current models of funding these individualized therapeutic treatments involve, particularly when compared to federally funded or large nonprofit funded research, and that you'll be able to identify some of the organizational ethical challenges in terms of access, resource allocation, and how these trials might deal with issues of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. So my grandfather certainly didn't write this particular little dictum, but he was the first one I heard it from, and so I'll hold on to that. So ethics is what you do in the dark before the fish and game warden gets there. I think all of us need to have a certain ethical compass because while there's hopefully wherever you are people around for whom you can ask opinions, either people like me who serve on a formal ethics committee, colleagues, valued friends, other resources. We all need to have a certain kind of compass of our own, and we also need to remember as neurologists that there's a fair body of evidence that we've developed as a group that shows that we tend to feel ethical decisions long before we come up with reasons for them. That is, it's buttressing the idea that if it feels wrong, it probably is, or if it feels something that makes you uneasy, you should pay attention to that. There's a lot of nice fMRI work which shows when we give people ethical or other moral dilemmas to deal with, put them inside an fMRI and look at them, what first lights up is the so-called limbic circuitry, and only a few hundred milliseconds later do the frontal lobes light up, so that we paper over what it is we feel with whatever system we think we have. You know, I'm a deontologist and therefore I think this, or I'm a consequentialist and I think that. And so I also think it's important when we're talking about a novel topic such as N of 1 therapeutics that you really can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. So I'd like to back us up for a moment and just do a brief review of some of the ways we tend to think about issues in bioethics. There are any of a number of approaches to medical ethics present in our current environment. Deontologic, what we can think of as those things derived from first principles. That is the idea that there are certain basic tenets that are held by everybody, and one can never go against those. Immanuel Kant, for example, is a Western instance of somebody who had a set of principles which we cannot forego. There are consequentialist, which is a derivative essentially of utilitarian ethics. What is the greatest good for the greatest number, and how do we sort that out? There are virtue ethics. That is the idea that if we, in fact, inculcate virtue in practitioners, then they will make logical and rational decisions. Probably the best example of that in the West was Aristotle and Aristotelian ethics. Aristotle argued that if one cultivated virtue oneself, then the decisions that one made in any given setting would be therefore ethical, in the same way that a stone can only roll down a hill, not up a hill. There are narrative ethics. That is, if you tell me your story, let me know. It will let me know what's going on in terms of the context of your life and how it is we understand your thinking. There are certainly feminist ethical critiques saying that most of the things that we think about in traditional Western biomedical ethics are terribly male-centric, and the hierarchy thereof, and therefore we need to reconsider that. Diepzit Tsai and his colleagues in Taiwan have developed an entire school of Neo-Confucian ethics to think about the complex problems of our current era from that tradition. But most medical ethics services in most hospitals in North America, as well as those based in other medical settings, tend to rely heavily on a form of ethical reasoning that's often referred to as principlism. This was first delineated by Ruddock in the late 20th century in the United Kingdom. It was then nuanced and somewhat reorganized by Raphael Gillon in the United Kingdom, and then further developed by two medical ethicists here in the United States, Beecham and Childress, subsequent to that. So there's an example of Ruddock's image. This is Gillon. And here are Beecham and Childress. This immediately demonstrates one of the significant issues that Western, especially European-derived biomedical ethics has, which is a real white man problem, to which I've further contributed by my existence. And maybe we can return to that during our question and answer session. But as it has been delineated by those four persons and further honed, there's a notion that there are four fundamental principles to which we can have recourse if we're walking through an ethical issue or dilemma. And those would include, probably issues that are familiar to you all. The notion of autonomy. Each person is sovereign over themselves and has an absolute right to the integrity of their person. In pediatric practice, that's somewhat more complicated, since most children actually do not have the ability to be sovereign over themselves, and therefore we depend upon surrogates in their instance, most often parents, sometimes people who are standing in for parents, to act in the child's best interest. This issue comes up again near the end of the life cycle, in which people lose the ability to make ethical decisions on their own behalf, and will have a proxy making those decisions for them once again. There's the notion of beneficence. What is ultimately important for us all in medical decision-making is that we have the patient's best interests fundamentally in our hearts, and that we need to be beneficent in our operations. Non-maleficence is a related but separate concept that at base, we must do no harm to our patients. One of the oldest medical principles in the West, at least, coming from the Hippocratic aphorism, whoever that collectivity that came to be known as Hippocrates was, first, no harm. And then finally, there's the notion of justice. That is, we must seek to have our practices in any given setting be just. And that can include notions of distributive justice, that is, trying to right some of the wrongs of the past. It can make an attention to equity within the context of our practice. It therefore may be an important principle that we need to consider in our discussions today. This is not a hierarchy. In any given situation, one of these principles may be more useful for you or more important in your reasoning than others. However, in the United States in particular, we find that autonomy is viewed as a singularly important part of medical decision-making. Many systems look at ours and say that in some ways, American medicine is autonomy run amok in terms of how much respect and space we give towards decision-making. And again, perhaps we can come back to that a little bit later in the hour. We also feel here in the United States that participation in research should be absolutely voluntary. It should be well informed, that is, people should know what it is they're signing up for, and ultimately needs to reflect the individual's existence as an autonomous moral being who is endowed with free choice. In pediatric settings, this becomes further confounded by who speaks for the minor or dependent offspring. So we have tended in general in North American practice to give parents wide deference in decision-making around their children's medical care, as well as their choice to have their minor or dependent offspring participate or decline to participate in research when that's offered. In addition to that, we have made children a somewhat privileged class in an ethical sense by saying we exclude them from participation in certain kinds of medical research, which I'll get to in a moment. We therefore invoke notions of non-maleficence and beneficence to curtail the autonomy of that child and that child's surrogates in certain settings. For example, phase 1 trials, which fundamentally by their design have really no possible benefit to the participant. They are designed to determine what the toxicity of any given therapy might be, pure and simple. If the harms are sufficient or potentially sufficient in that setting, in North American medical research practice, we have intended to exclude children from being able to participate in phase 1 trials. We say that that is not a kind of autonomy that parents can practice on behalf of their children. As a society, we have decided in some informal fashion that others will bear the burden of high risk and that parental autonomy can and should be curtailed in choosing risk exposure for minor persons, that is not a privilege, for example, that we grant parents within that setting. Lawrence McCullough, a biomedical ethicist, has created a model for thinking about this, where he argues that parents and physicians or other providers represent co-fiduciary aspects of a child's best interest. Each, in his argument, has a zone of maximal expertise and therefore fundamentally of maximal influence, and needs to defer to the other in that domain. For example, parents will know the hopes and dreams of their child better than anyone else in the room when it comes time to making a decision. They know and have some notion of where it is and what kind of a life they hope this child will live. Physicians, by their nature, and other providers know the medical outcomes and possible risks of a given treatment path or of a given research path better than anyone else. So therefore, McCullough argues that by this idea of co-fiduciary status, the physician community is ethically permitted to curtail some usual parental autonomy in the face of medical risk for treatment or research that may be considered too high, regardless of the parental wishes. That is, this is a curtailment in McCullough's argument of certain parts of parental autonomy over their children based upon not only beneficence and non-maleficence, but also the fact that the physician or provider has a greater knowledge in this particular domain. There's a picture of McCullough. So traditionally, this model taken together of everything we've just presented has worked rather well in our established model of phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. We know where and when we feel children and dependent offspring can fit in and when they cannot. For example, most trials begin with an animal model of reasonably good fidelity to a human disease, or with other model systems such as iPSCs, which give us some confidence in the biology of the disease process itself. Then somebody identifies a candidate compound that may influence this disease process, and after appropriate animal or other model system work, will attempt to advance this to human studies. Human participation in a trial is only permitted in the United States under the aegis of fully informed consent. And it's important for us to back up and look at where this arose from. This principle fundamentally, as we look over its history, emerged in research especially as a consequence of the Nuremberg doctors' trial, in which a panel of jurists and attorneys brought medical professionals who in National Socialist Germany had engaged in particularly heinous activities under the name of research and brought them to trial. It's important for us to remember that this was part of the whole set of so-called Nuremberg trials. Others were involved in the prosecution of people for the war that had been fought, for the ghastly execution of large numbers of persons. But this was particularly attendant on medical professionals, and in particular, the kind of research that they'd done. The panel of judges and the prosecution were entirely from the United States. So none of the other so-called Allied powers at the end of the Second World War actually were involved in the doctors' trial. This was a purely American jurisprudence. And the defense of the prosecution were entirely German nationals. The jurists, subsequent to this, wrote a code of medical ethics, which is known as the Nuremberg Code. So there were no physicians at all involved in the writing of this code. And the first point in the Nuremberg Code of Ethics was about permissible medical experiments. This took pole position in this writing. And it's worth, although this is a slide with lots of words, it's actually worth unpacking what goes on here. The voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential. This is where they began their code of ethics. This means that the person involved should have the legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise their free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him, language of the time, to make an understanding and enlightened decision. The latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him, language of the time, the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his, language of the time, health and person, which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be relegated to another with impunity. So it's a fairly stark statement. One of the things I think that's most important for us to remember, and one of the reasons this is a picture of the cover of a book written by George Annis and the late Michael Grodin on the Nazi doctors and the Nuremberg Code, to which I would really commend you because it's a wonderful exposition. But one of the things that is most important about this is that the jurists of the time and the prosecution were utterly struck by the fact that German medicine, which had been at the time of the rise of the National Socialist regime, the most evolved, medical system in the West had so wholeheartedly gone along with the National Socialist Project. The participation of physicians, both as members of the National Socialist Party in Germany, as well as in the SS, was above any other so-called liberal profession. Doctors joined up to an extent that far exceeded lawyers, teachers, or business people. And they thoroughly went off the rails. People who had known German academic life before this, including all of those jurists, recoiled in horror and wanted to set up a code that would make certain this could never happen again. Since American medicine has subsequently taken the position that German medicine had in many ways, it's an example worth considering. What's interesting to note is the way that this demand for informed consent dropped in subsequent versions of codes of medical ethics. So, for example, while it's first in the Nuremberg Code, the World Medical Association International Code of Medical Ethics, which was written in 1983 and then revised in 2006, dropped that assertion to sixth place in terms of its hierarchy of medical ethical values. So now let's finally turn our attention to the topic that I wanted to discuss in the first place, which are N-of-1 trials. By their nature, if we're creating a compound specifically for one individual, this automatically collapses the trial in terms of phases 1, 2, and 3. Right? There may be compelling or highly suggestive animal work, but it's often not completely equivalent to the human experience. For example, if we look at the more widespread distribution of spinal muscular atrophy, and we look at the mouse models that were used to investigate the oligonucleotide known as nusinersen or Spinraza by its trade name, the mouse model of spinal muscular atrophy, while it shares genes because they're preserved across multiple parts of evolution, is actually a rather poor clinical congener. Mice with SMA actually don't look much like humans with SMA. And animal work in many N-of-1 trials, where there is a unique genetic problem in a given person for whom an oligonucleotide may be a reasonable approach or treatment, the animal work that's available may be limited at best to toxicologic studies. That is, what does it appear this oligonucleotide does from that basis, which are some lukewarm comfort to us. This is part, but only part, of what a phase 1 trial might be like in terms of the toxicologic work. So without good science, there can never be good medical ethics. Antisense oligonucleotides, for a whole variety of reasons, are prime candidates for N-of-1 trials, and ASOs experienced an early victory with spinal muscular atrophy, since they were seemingly quite effective in terms of arresting the progress of that disease process. However, it's important for us to remember that the ASO was introduced into the lumbar thecal region and actually had a relatively short distance to perfuse to enter the target site, which was spinal anterior horn cells. Given the size of a child's spine and spinal cord, this is a relatively short trip. However, many other rare diseases which are viewed as candidates for N-of-1 trials are cortical or subcortical in the burden of their pathology. And delivering critical doses of an ASO and getting them to the needed location is not necessarily well predicted by spinal muscular atrophy that is something that is predominantly anterior horn cell in its location. In addition, there may be many challenges to having adequate biomarkers to determine the efficacy of treatment. In spinal muscular atrophy, we had the relatively straightforward notion of what is preserved in terms of motoric function and the use of many, or several, not many, standardized physical therapy scales was utilized in the early trials and is subsequently utilized in the determination of efficacy. Many diseases that are targets or considered targets for N of 1 therapy are characterized in childhood by progressive cognitive decline, which is actually difficult to measure from a biomarker perspective, and advancing epilepsy, for again, which we have at best imperfect markers. Seizure burden, for anybody who's ever tried to do that, is a difficult thing to count reliably and seems to have a great variability from observer to observer. Therefore, our ability to measure these with the same accuracy that motor function in spinal muscular atrophy was measured is not equivalent and should never be viewed as such. If we take an example of one of the first N of 1 trials that was done here in the United States, Batten's disease, that is a form of neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis. There are no good models for Batten's disease among animals. And the patient may likely express a unique molecular mechanism which shows promise for technology such as oligonucleotide therapy. In the end, we face the ethical issue of administering an agent we think will work, but for which we have little proof. We believe, based upon toxicology studies, is actually not that toxic, for a disease process for which we have limited biomarkers of efficacy, to a minor child for whom we are the primary co-fiduciary of medical best interest. This is balanced against the progressive and usually fatal nature of many of the diseases in question. We have lined up desperate parents. We want you to do everything for our child, which is a completely understandable impetus for treatment. We have uncertain clinical providers, that is physicians. You have no idea what everything actually is. We have well-intended investigators. We can't sit by and watch this happen if we know something. And we have at the center of this a child whose wishes, by the nature of their disease, were actually never known and unknowable. So Graham Greene, one of my favorite writers and in his own way, ethicist, in The Quiet American, had a character comment on another character, God save us always from the innocent and the good. So I think if we try to unpack this problem, we can go back to our notion of ethical principles, justice. In this setting, I think several important issues emerge. Access. Does everyone actually have equal access on a fair basis to a new technology? Most of the ultra-rare diseases in neurology tend to actually be equal opportunity afflictors. That is, they tend to involve people across the entirety of the demographic spectrum. There are some particular disorders that do cluster in certain particular demographic groups and populations, but many of the diseases that we have under consideration actually are equally distributed across the population. And yet, does the entirety of that population have access to this kind of medical care? There's also the notion of fair innings. Does everyone have an ability to benefit from a treatment that will give them either a longer life or a better life? And what assessments do we use? Do we use metrics such as disability-adjusted life years or quality-adjusted life years, which are thought in many quarters to denigrate the dignity and value of lives lived with certain disorders? And also, we have the challenge of prioritization. Do we prioritize the first trials that we do in any given setting, either geographic or medical, by need, by severity? We will do almost anything we can in medicine to actually avoid the R word, rationing. Americans like to believe that they don't ration healthcare, and so we do all sorts of dances around that. I'd submit that we all ration things all the time. The first and foremost of which we've all had an example today, we ration our time. I have a finite number of hours between when I arrived at the hospital this morning and when I'll eventually get to leave this evening. And I have to make choices over with whom and how to spend that time. And then finally, funding. How and who decides what work gets funded, particularly for ultra-rare disorders such as this? So if we think about research and who funds research, we can consider any of a number of possibilities. Is there disinterested philanthropy? That is, foundations that say we in general have an interest in either a category of disorders or diseases, or in medical research in general. The commonweal, that is the public, the National Institutes of Health, and other federally funded organizations. What about the afflicted with means? Families who have a child that's afflicted by some dreadful illness and happen to have sufficient means that they want to spur research in their child's particular disorder. Or the marketplace. Biopharmaceutical firms may think that they can monetize some discovery that we make, and therefore may be interested in funding those sorts of things which seem more readily monetized compared to others for which there won't be much of a market. So I think at this point, we need to take a brief digression through something you undoubtedly encountered at some point in your training in ethics philosophy, or maybe just sitting around and chatting with other people, the so-called trolley problem. Frances Cam, who's a philosopher and ethicist here at Harvard, has argued for a bottom-up deontology. That is, she argues that not that you hold some great and noble set of beliefs. Beliefs can be great and noble, there's no doubt about that. But she argues that, in fact, when you examine human behavior, what you do is you actually make a series of choices. And the series of choices that you make demonstrate your beliefs and principles rather than asking you what are the overlying beliefs and principles of your life. That is, you reveal what your deontology is as opposed to declare it. If you remember the trolley problem, the notion is that there's a trolley that's going out of control down a track, and there's a bifurcation in the track, and you're standing at the switch. And you have to send the trolley in one direction or another. And therefore, do you send it in the simplest version down a track where there's one person standing who might be victimized by the runaway trolley versus 5 persons? Cam has made up a perfidious set of different conditions for the trolley problem, with different people populating those tracks in almost any way you can imagine. And she argues that if I give you the trolley problem in all of these various iterations, you will begin to demonstrate what your beliefs are. Here's an example of Cam in action, describing the trolley problem to a class. So we might argue that our choices for funding novel research, such as N-of-1 trials, tell us a lot more about what we believe as a society than mountains of scholarly papers or piles of regulations or hillocks of noble white papers written by various commissions. So Alistair McIntyre has argued that in the United States after the Second World War, we have lacked a common narrative viewpoint on ethical discussions in our current society. In his 2 most well-known books, After Virtue and Whose Justice, Which Rationality, he argues that before the Second World War, there was essentially an imposed dominant set of cultural values that he'll identify actually as neo-Stoicism after the Greco-Roman philosophic theory, as opposed to so-called Judeo-Christian. But that subsequent to developments in society, we have a marketplace of ideas where people bring to the ethical encounters that we all have. The marketplace that we think of is within the context of the hospital, from any of a variety of different settings and situations. Here's a picture of McIntyre. So if we consider another time of multiple cultures encountering one another and how they sorted out ethical problems, this might be of some use. Again, I said ethicists like models. And as I was trying to walk through this problem of N-of-1 trials, because we've had quite a few, the place where I work, Boston Children's Hospital, is probably among the top 3 or 4 places in the United States for the number of N-of-1 trials it's evolved. And therefore, we needed to have some way of thinking about them in a systematic way. So therefore, if we have all sorts of people who bring any of a variety of ethical values to the table, to the marketplace, to our discussion, how is it that we can walk through this if we don't all think and reason in the same ethical fashion? And so the model that I went back to is something that the Spanish philologist Americo Castro hypothesized, looking at a certain period of Spain's history called La Convivencia. This looked at the social, cultural, and intellectual life of Al-Andalus, that is the Iberian Peninsula, between the Umayyad conquest of Hispania, the Roman province, in the early 8th century of the Common Era, to the expulsion of the Jews from this place in 1492. Castro argued that Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in significant proximity to one another on this piece of real estate without ignoring each other or isolating from each other, or amazingly, spending much time slaughtering each other. All of the above had been options in other parts of the world, but here people lived together. And Cordoba, with its library, schools, and learned institutions, was one of the major intellectual centers in the 9th to 12th centuries of the Common Era. There was a problem that had to be faced by those persons, which was mandated giving. All three religious traditions had a requirement to give to the common weal, known as zakat in Muslim practice, tzedakah in Jewish practice, and tithing in the Christian practice. And all three traditions were struggling with how to apply these rules in an increasingly material, prosperous society, right? If you're not spending all that much time slaughtering one another or going to war, the economy tends to do better, and therefore people had to sort through the problem of this kind of mandated giving in that setting. And so one of the people that worked through these issues is known in the West by his Greco-Romanized name, Moses Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon, the Rambam, who is one of those extraordinary intellectuals of the era, physician, astronomer, philosopher, jurist, and theologian. Probably his two best-known works were A Guide for the Perplexed and then a commentary, the Mishnah Torah. And there's a representation of his image in Cordoba. May not be what he actually looked like, but it's a nice statue. And so he actually created a hierarchy of giving that one could use to think about this mandated giving. The highest level of giving was to endow the afflicted with such things as to render them never in need again of being a recipient. The next level was that neither donor nor recipient should know who the other are, and that the giving was a show of beneficence alone, that is, of one's virtue. The next level was that the donor knows who the recipient is, but the recipient was unaware of the benefactor's existence. The next level was that the donor is unaware of the recipient, but the recipient knows of the donor. The next level was giving to a known recipient and giving before you were asked. And then the last levels are giving to a known recipient after you're asked. The next level was to give gladly, but not enough. And then the lowest level was to give unwillingly. I would argue that he had a huge knowledge of human psychology to come up with this, and particularly the complicated relationships between donor and recipient. So how do our funding mechanisms in our current world line up by this model? I would argue that federal funding is by and large at the second highest level of giving. That is, large numbers of people give through taxes and others receive, researchers and patients in their trials, but both are unaware of the other's identity. At the end of the day, somebody who receives an R01 has no idea which particular taxpayer's money went into the funding, and all of us who write our tax check on an annual basis have no idea who's going to get that part of our tax dollars. This is essentially along the Western lines of from each according to their abilities and to each according to their needs. And an authority that is viewed as impartial and ultimately ignorant of donor identities and masked from the essential identities of the ultimate recipients makes this decision. That is, study sections and congressional committees within the purview of the federal government. Disinterested philanthropy, that is, the donor doesn't know the identity of those who benefit from their gift by and large. So you can think at your own institution of any named laboratory, research initiative, or other entity, but those benefiting can see the name on the building, fit into the fourth level of giving. So on my way to the office today, I passed once again by the Ina Perlmutter Laboratories for the study of cystic fibrosis given by the Perlmutter family. Anybody who is benefiting from research done by that institute certainly knows, at least can look up at the building and see that that's the identity of the family who did that. The Perlmutter family had no idea who was going to benefit from their generosity in funding and continuing to fund this laboratory. And then we have the afflicted with means, that is, family foundations which are established for their particular afflicted child's illness. In this instance, the donor and the recipient know each other, and arguably there is an ask. So level 6 of Maimonides' hierarchy, if you're so inclined. Maimonides was particularly wary in his commentaries of this because of the nature of being subsequently beholden, the donor to the recipient and the recipient to the donor. Is the donor, in essence, actually renting the laboratory of the medical center, the hospital, the unit, the institution for the period of this research? And since time, as we've already discussed, is the ultimate zero-sum game, what is not happening in the life of that laboratory, that institution, that unit that might otherwise be going on when they are engaged in this kind of research, which is designed by its nature to benefit one person and one person only? Does the donation therefore set the agenda? We accept this as part of the common wheel. The National Institutes of Health set up priorities for any given funding cycle and say, these are the things that we are looking into. We want to support the investigation thereof. But because this is something done in the public interest, we argue that the public has an ability to influence how those decisions are made. We accept the disinterested philanthropic gift because it may align with our strategy as an institution. My institution, decades ago, accepted the gift of the Perlmutter family that I mentioned there because there was a vested interest in the institution in terms of trying to improve the lives and the outcomes of persons with cystic fibrosis, and both basic as well as clinical research were felt to be a path to that goal. And how do we protect this type of donation from hijacking our overall institutional strategy or our societal strategies? The marketplace ultimately relies on the potential for commodification of a given discovery. So I can't argue that this is necessarily ethically bad. Much of our essential existence is commodified: food, housing, travel, ultimately in the United States, education. And these are regulated in our ethical conduct in a different manner than philanthropy. And it can be fraught trying to deal with a given ethical issue with a system that's not designed or intrinsically able to assess it. So I would argue that our ethical systems for regulating both disinterested philanthropy and philanthropy essentially at the public good have evolved, and evolved fairly elegantly over the course of the Republic's life, albeit always in need of reform and redirection. But that the marketplace and probably individual philanthropy are not well matched with the structures that we have already evolved. We tend to consider religious and other exemptions for vaccination under the aegis of autonomy, but with too great a deference to autonomy and insufficient consideration of justice, right? Innocent persons contracting measles because of your autonomous decision not to actually immunize your child against measles has led to calamity in several places here in the United States, of which we're all painfully aware. Nusinersen is very expensive for a variety of complex reasons that maybe we'll have time to talk about in a little while. In the United Kingdom, the calculus for NHS coverage for a given medication includes a cost threshold for each quality-adjusted life year, above which the system cannot and will not go because resources are finite. Thus, our ethical metrics of fair innings and autonomous patient choice led to a general acceptance of this agent and its cost, but by a different medical ethic metric, the United Kingdom came to a vastly different conclusion, whereas, you know, nusinersen is actually not covered by the National Health Service. I would submit that our ethical assessment for public funding, disinterested philanthropy, and perhaps targeted philanthropy can use a common framework, but we likely need a different framework for marketplace-based funding. So our current assessment structures, such as traditional IRBs, may not have the expertise and mental models needed to consider some of these emerging technologies. And we may need to therefore consider other models of governance and oversight for thinking about these trials more effectively than those systems which we have at present. One of my favorite abolitionist hymns, a poem actually written during the Mexican-American War, by James Russell Lowell, observes that time makes ancient good uncouth. And therefore, we constantly need to rethink how it is we consider things from an ethical standpoint as events evolve. So I thank you for your kind attention, and I'm more than happy to open this up to questions in the time that we have. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
May I go first, please?
Surely.
Thank you again for a very enlightening, important point that, again, as we go older and as we gain more experience, we realize, how important it is in our management. So I thank you immensely. And again, the NF1, many of us were involved, but didn't quite put that name to it till the 50th CNS, meeting at Boston a couple of years ago. Then again, it was prominently shared with everyone, and we all woke up. And other thing I just wanted to comment was your statement about obituary, which really caught my ear. And of course, I always felt I know more about a person by reading the obits. But now, like you said, maybe we should give more talks and get introduced and know while alive what we all have done, and so that we can mentor more people. But I thank you. Thank you, Danielle, for having Dr. Urion with us.
I do also have one question. I did want to, I guess, talk a little bit about, ask you a little bit about, as you said, federal funding, which is our usually our highest form of donations in this country. And obviously, taxpayers always have an idea of what they want their taxes to be used for, but how would one, I guess, put those two together in terms of ethical means? At least during my time in college, people actually tended to put that under forced or unwanted giving, since you have to pay taxes.
Yeah, so it is interesting. It's one of the reasons why I was drawn to the notion of mandated giving within the context of the convivencia. It was a religious demand in all three of the great traditions that we're living in Al-Andalus, that one gave a certain percentage of one's goods, wealth, etc., on an annual basis. And although it varied slightly from custom to custom or from group to group, it was still viewed as a demand. Is that wanted or is that not? There were also religious notions that one needed to do this not only in point of fact, but also with a glad heart. And there are certainly scriptural traditions in all three that support this notion of giving and giving cheerfully. I think that we are losing, because of the nature of the fractious dialogue that we have here in the United States, the notion that we somehow are all in this together. And the only way to do this together is that we have to have some money to do some of these issues. And therefore, taxes are the way that we do that in most republics settings, small r. I would totally agree with your observation that there is part of our dialogue now that views this always as oppressive, and that will lead to a further fracturing of how it is we do things that are important for all of us and to all of us. I think the other thing we have to think about quite carefully within that setting is how do we protect important, because they're all important, minorities from the tyranny of the majority. And I think that this was one of the real problems with federal funding for a long period of time. We know that disorder, because priorities were set in essence by the Congress, which tended to be a province of older white men. The diseases of older white men tended to get lots of funding, and the diseases of children, as anybody who's been in pediatrics for a period of time knows, and women and other persons who are not middle-aged white men tended not to get much funding. However, one can hope that in a republic, we actually have mechanisms and structures to rectify those injustices and to confront them directly. I think it becomes more difficult the further away we get from reasoned public discourse for how it is we assure that people will be given a fair set of innings, to use again that ethical model in this setting. And I think that that is certainly a challenge as we are having this conversation in the last few days before it would appear the federal government is going to shut down again based upon a tyranny of a small group of people who have their hands on certain levers of power. But we also need to think about it in a broader sense, since we'll hopefully get through this shutdown as all the others that I've managed to live through. And think about some of these other domains, about how is it that we make certain that other parts of our philanthropic process respond to the quite important demands that we have given happily greater voice to for equity and justice over the course of the last several years.
Thank you. And I did just want to make, I guess, one more comment. One thing that you had reminded me when you were talking about the Nuremberg Code, which actually would relate to our ethics principles today, and I think does play into our, I guess, how we rank fair innings in terms of how we decide medical care is given and funded. I guess all of, as you said, the people that were on the trial were American and the defense was German, even though it wasn't.
It's horrible outside.
At the same time, America was also having their own experiments that were obviously non-ethical, both here and in Guatemala. So I do wonder how that does impact our medical ethics today, given that even though we say that it should be voluntary and that human life is precious, just based on the fact that these things were said while we were doing our own experiments, how that does impact us today in terms of when we do make decisions about N of 1 trials and what is it worth to be paid for.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up. Obviously, Tuskegee and then several of our dreadful events in Central America, Nicaragua and Guatemala, can be brought to bear and utterly fail the standard that we ourselves set at the Nuremberg trials. You can be cynical and say that victors always get to set the agenda. And there's a level at which historically, I suppose that's true. But the Nuremberg Code also gave critics here within the United States very ample ground on which to stand to say that these actions are inexcusable. I think what's interesting, if we look at Tuskegee, is that quite early on, it was pointed out, by a rather famous letter that was then deep-sixed by the Journal of the American Medical Association from a provider in the very early days of the Tuskegee trials, that not only was this manifestly unethical, but that the Journal of the American Medical Association had no business publishing something that was such a violation of fundamental ethics. It was tacked to the manuscript and not further commented upon. The author actually of the letter never even got the courtesy of a response from the editors of the journal, but it's subsequently been found in their archives. So I think your point is absolutely well taken and completely valid. We just need to know that one of the things that the Nuremberg Code did is it gave critics here in the United States a structure or a framework by which they could say, not only is this wrong, because it obviously was wrong, but here is a set of principles written by American jurists that say this is wrong, and therefore it should apply in this setting as well. Interestingly, very few organized medical jurisdictions actually ever adopted the Nuremberg Code. It sits out there, as a thing. But it was never fully embraced, certainly was never fully embraced by most entities in organized American medicine. But it was used as a principle in argument, and I think that is its that was its utility in addressing the heinous crimes of that. And there's a lot of work that's subsequently shown what the continuing consequence of Tuskegee is. There was a fairly elegant paper written, I think, about 5 years ago now, in one of the economics journals that looked at what the consequences in the population of African-American men here in the United States was of excess morbidity, excess mortality, and economic loss associated with being avoidant of seeking medical care because of a lack of trust directly related to Tuskegee. The economists did this in a fairly nice fashion, grinding huge amounts of data to look at it. But it's a compelling argument that, in fact, this has not, despite all of our recognition, that this is awful, it continues to have an absolute presence in our daily lives as practitioners.
Thank you. Yes. So if someone wants to go ahead. Thank you again, Dr. Ryan.
Thank you.
Hello, my name. Sorry, Brian and Ziska. Can I just make a quick comment? The Nuremberg Code was written entirely by jurists. There were no physicians involved in, or medical practitioners involved in this code. Similarly, informed consent, in some ways, has a sort of a problem. The problem is that this has been used by trial lawyers to sue doctors for not mentioning the 13th out of 12 possible side effects, although this had no adverse effect on the patient, and it's become a substitute for the decrease of successful malpractice suits. Why is the medical profession not involved in purely inpatient care, such as termination of pregnancy, end of life care, etc., and the legal profession or congressional members? And the latest is a imposition of an 8-hour mandatory course in pain on the medical profession without us even knowing about it. We are completely excluded from making decisions as to patient care. This is made by legislators, lawyers, etc.
No, I think that those observations are absolutely true. I mean, it was quite clear that the Nuremberg Code was not drafted with any input in medicine. The same is fundamentally true from what you say in terms of informed consent. I think that we have lots of examples in our history where the only way one gets a seat at the table for important discussions, the metaphoric table, is to demand a seat at the table, as opposed to wait to be invited to the table. We see this over and over again in the long struggle for a whole variety of civil rights here in the history of our republic. And so I think only when we, as both organized bodies within medicine, as well as individuals, demand that we be present within the context of these discussions and not say that they are only germane to the legislature itself, will we see any redress to the issues which I think you importantly raise.
Thank you.
Okay, not to go too much over anyone's time, but we will end our grand rounds here for today.